Thank you so much to the Shiloh Museum of Ozark History for having me here tonight. It's good to be in Arkansas because I do have some ties. My dad is from Helena. So he moved out to Denver in the 60s and met my mother, who's from Chattanooga, Tennessee. So that's how I earned street cred, because I have to tell you, I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado. But even in an unlikely place like that, my parents kept us steeped in black culture. And so I grew up, having soul food, barbecue, going to a black church, and so that's how I connect with this tradition. So tonight we're going to talk about barbecue and its African-American roots. So what I'm going to do is first of all tell you my journey and how I became a soul food and barbecue expert, and then we're just going to go through the themes of my book. So we'll talk about the early history of barbecue, and then we'll just go through the chapters which are thematic, and I'll talk about barbecue stories, and then give you my thoughts on the current trends in barbecue, and then I'll take your questions. All right. I call myself the soul food scholar who's dropping knowledge like hot biscuits. That's what I endeavor to do tonight. If you are on social media, you can follow me on any platform. Just put in Soul Food Scholar and you'll find me. So please, if you enjoy this presentation, go online, give a brother some love. We would greatly appreciate it. If you hate what I say tonight, just keep it to yourself. There's no reason to post. As you heard earlier, grew up in Denver, went to Stanford undergrad, went to Georgetown Law School. Then I came back to Denver and practiced law for about 4 years. I primarily did litigation and employment law. And this is not to disparage anybody who's an attorney, or you have attorneys in your family or in your social networks. Practicing law was not for me. I pretty much hated it. And it got to the point where I was singing spirituals in my office. And just to let you know how bad it was in law firms, when I would start singing, white people would join in. I remember one time I was talking to my colleague Becky at the copier, and I said, "Hey Becky, how's it going?" She just looked at me and said, "Nobody knows the trouble I've seen." I'm like, man, this is rough. So I was gonna open up a soul food restaurant, had a chef, I was raising money, and then out of the blue, a friend of mine from Georgetown Law School called me and said, "Adrian, I'm working in the Clinton White House. We have an opening and we're looking to do a quick hire." So she wanted me to recommend somebody else to fill that position. I said, "Well, tell me about this job." So she was working on something called the President's Initiative for One America. It was an outgrowth of President Clinton's initiative on race. And here was the crazy idea behind the initiative on race. You ready for this? If we just talked to one another and listened, we might realize that we have a lot more in common than what supposedly divides us. Wild, right? I know, can you believe that? So that got launched in 1998, went on for about 2 years, and when that was finished, the people that put that together said, "Mr. President, you need to have an ongoing office in the White House to follow up on the initiative on race," and that became the Initiative for One America. So that's what I worked on. So packed up my stuff, went to the White House, enjoyed my time. Here I am in the Oval Office. Now, this is a question that I ask all of my audiences. I know I'm gonna have some good answers here. Has anybody here ever met President Clinton? Okay, tell us about that story. What was that like, meeting President Clinton?
Well, there's several that are kind of going in my mind. The first one, when I first moved to Arkansas, I was at an event with him. And of course, a whole lot of people. And so he comes up and we say hello, and I'm ready to talk to him, and he's looking off to where he's going to go next.
Oh, really? Okay. Who's got a more engaging story?
Let me tell you another one.
Okay.
So then we go to the inauguration, my husband and I, and we're going through the line, and he knows David. They've worked together. And so I'm behind David, and I'm walking up, and usually somebody tells the name of the person that's coming. Nobody told him my name, and he said, "Hello, Patty."
Yep, okay, great. The second one was better. Okay, got it. So yeah, most people, oh, he just draws you in. He makes you feel like you're the only person in the room. Such a wonderful experience. I worked for him for 1.5 years, and I never got that. Every time I met him, it was like the first time I'd say, "Mr. President," he would just look at me. I'd say, "My name is Adrian Miller," still a blank look, kind of like the one you're giving me right now. "I work on your One America initiative." Then he would say something like, "Well, that's great," or whatever, when we talk about it. Yeah. And then a woman would walk by and he'd call her out by name. I was like, That's another story for another day. So, after my time in the Clinton White House, at that point in my life, I actually wanted to be in politics. I wanted to go back to my home state of Colorado and eventually start my political career and then eventually run for the US Senate. So I wanted to be one of the US senators representing Colorado. So the job market was really slow at that time, and it was hard to get a job. So I was basically spending a lot more time in DC than I ever expected, and it got to the point where I was watching a lot of daytime television, and I thought, you know what, I should read something. So I went to a local bookstore, and I'm browsing the cookbook section because I love to cook, and I see this book on the shelf called Southern Food at Home, on the Road, in History, written by a guy named John Edgerton. It's the first book that I'd ever read that had food history in it. And if you have not heard of that book, you need to get it. It's a must-have. So I'm reading that book, and I turned to page 14, and there's a sentence that changed my life. Mr. Edgerton wrote that the tribute to Black achievement in American cooking has yet to be written. And I thought, okay, the book is 14 years old when I picked it up. I thought for sure somebody has taken on that task. And I reached out to him on email, and he said, you know what, nobody's done it. There's always room for another voice, so why not yours? So at that point, that's what started my journey. But I was still in DC, watching a lot of daytime television. I'm really embarrassed to tell you the shows that I was watching. Jerry. So in the depth of my depravity, I got it together and I started doing research, and I did eventually get a political job in Denver. So I moved back to Denver, and I was basically like an amateur grad student. So after work and on the weekends, I went to the Denver Public Library and just grabbed everything I could on Black food traditions. And here's the work that I did over the course of about 12 years as a side hustle. I read 3,500 oral histories of formerly enslaved people, and I outlined every reference to food. I read 500 cookbooks, half of them authored by African Americans because I wanted to put Black food traditions in a larger context. So I was looking at cookbooks from other cultures to see what was similar and not so similar. I read thousands of newspaper and magazine articles, and then talked to hundreds of people. And then because I cared so deeply about my subject, I decided to eat my way through the country. So I went to 150 soul food restaurants in 35 cities in 15 states. I know, my sister, you're surprised I'm still alive. I am too. That's the research that I did. If you were one of my social media friends, I brought you along for the ride. So I was one of the early people taking pictures of my food and all that kind of stuff. So got to follow it. So for all of that work, that set basically the context for every book that I've written. So the first book was Soul Food, The Surprising Story of an American Cuisine, One Plate at a Time. Given all of that research, I had so much information, I was really struggling on how to write that book. And I decided to organize it by creating a representative soul food meal. I write a chapter about every part of the meal. I explain what it is, how it gets on the soul food plate, what it means for the culture. And then most chapters have recipes, traditional, health conscious, and then a fancy one in case you want to show off as a cook. All right, so we're just going to quickly go through the meal. We're going to go to church because I'm part of the Black faith tradition. So if I list something that you like, say amen. Amen. All right. If you don't like it, you can just hold on to that. All right, so let's go through the meal. Fried chicken. Amen. Catfish. Amen. Chitlins. All right, I wasn't expecting much. For the uninitiated, in case you've never heard of chitlins, it's pig intestines, usually stewed or fried. Not for everybody. Then for side dishes, greens. Most popular are collard, kale, mustard, turnip. I personally cook a combination of mustard and turnip with smoked turkey. That's what I usually do. And then I wrote, and for those of you who have been introduced to kale in the last 5 to 10 years, welcome to the party because we've been eating it for about 300. Black eyed peas. Mac and cheese. Candy jams. All right. Now, I have to admit, I wasn't going to include mac and cheese in my book because I thought it's so universal. There's no Black angle here. So many of my Black friends threatened to slap me upside my head that I succumbed to peer pressure and put it in the book. I included it in the book. And then I wrote a chapter about cornbread, chapter about hot sauce. And then I wrote a chapter about red drink because I believe that red Kool-Aid is the official soul food drink. You have to understand, in soul food culture, red is a color and a flavor. So black people, we don't call things cherry or strawberry or that it has hints of cranberry. It's just red. Yeah, thank you. Now there is a generational shift happening. There are a lot of youngins that like to seem to like purple and blue. And as I wrote in my book, I do believe the children are our future, that we should teach them well and let them lead the way, but not on Kool-Aid, because they're messing it up. And then I couldn't settle on one dessert, so I wrote about 4. Pound cake, peach cobbler, banana pudding, sweet potato pie. So that was the book, and I won the James Beard Award for Outstanding Scholarship and Reference. Thank you. And then based on the research in that book, I came across a few stories of African Americans who had cooked for our presidents. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. Let me see what I can find. Because 6 people that's not enough to write a book. Maybe a long essay, but not a book. Based on my research, I identified 150 African Americans who have cooked for our presidents. Every single president of the United States, from George Washington to Donald Trump, has had an African American cooking for them in some capacity, and this is their first collective biography. So I was really proud to tell that story. So this book was nominated for an NAACP Image Award for Best Literary Nonfiction. So I went out to Hollywood, went to the ceremony, it was really cool. I did not win, but I got closer to a lifelong goal. I've always wanted to meet Halle Berry. And the year that my book was nominated, she was one of the presenters. So here's the progress that I made, y'all. We were in the same building at the same time. Pretty cool, right? Actually, if you go back and look at footage from the ceremony when she's presenting the award, she actually stumbled over her words, and that was the exact moment when our eyes met. Even though I was sitting way up in the balcony. All right. And then tonight's book came out of the soul food book because I originally was going to include a chapter on barbecue in the soul food book, because so many black-run barbecue joints have soul food sides, and so many soul food restaurants have a barbecue option, so there's a lot of synergy. But there was so much material on barbecue, I decided that I would do it as a separate thing. And then my latest book is an outgrowth of the President's Kitchen Cabinet, because as I was doing research on all the African Americans who have cooked for our presidents, I found out that we've had a number of people of Asian heritage cook for our president. Essentially, the short story is this. After the Spanish-American War, the US Navy started recruiting people from other countries, primarily from Asia, and they served on the presidential yacht. And you're probably saying, we had a presidential yacht? Yeah. We used to until Carter sold it. But from Lincoln to Carter, we had a presidential yacht. And for a number of reasons, Asian heritage people served initially there and then have been in all branches of White House or presidential cooking, including the White House chef right now is a son of Thai immigrants. So there's fascinating history. All right, so that's my writing journey. But here we're talking about barbecue. As I mentioned, I was going to include barbecue in my original book, but I decided I would get to it later. But then things started happening on my journey as I was writing about soul food. One day I was watching the Food Network, and I saw a commercial for Paula Deen's Southern Barbecue. And I thought, you know what, let me watch this and just see who gets highlighted, what are the trends, all this kind of stuff. So I watched that show, and 60 minutes later, as the credits are rolling, I realized not one African American was featured on that show. Yes, your mouth should be open for a reason, yes. On a show about barbecue in the American South. So then I thought, well, maybe I got it twisted. Maybe I saw a commercial for Paula Deen's Scandinavian Barbecue. Sponsored by Alabama White Sauce, that was just So that said to me, hey, something needs to change. Somebody needs to know the true history of barbecue, and that's what led to this book, Black Smoke. So let's spend a moment and talk about old school barbecue. This is from Harper's Weekly, November 9th, 1896. This was something called the Atlanta Exposition. So this was a multi-week event, and they had a live barbecue installation is what we would call it today, but they had live barbecue. So here's old school barbecue, the way it was for a few centuries. You get a clearing, you clear all the debris, all that stuff out, and then you dig a pit or a trench, a few feet deep, a few feet wide. You chop a bunch of trees, and then you fill that pit up with hardwood and set it afire until it burned down to hardwood burning coals, and then you would get your animals and butcher them. It wasn't always pigs. They would do sheep as well. If they did cows, they would quarter them because they're too big. And then they would get poles basically and butterfly the carcass and stick the poles in the side so that they could be flipped. That was old school barbecue. So here's a good representation of it. You've got these two African American men doing the even cooking. On the side here, you've got a guy and his shovel is a hardwood coal, or basically coals, because a separate fire was kept. And this guy's job was just to walk up and down the pit and look for cold spots and then fill in the coals. You've got a group of white people here just beholding the whole scene, truly spectators. You've got two African American men here who are practicing their music because they were the after barbecue entertainment. Then you've got a guy on top here making something called Brunswick stew. Do y'all know about Brunswick stew? For those who don't know, it's the descendant of a hunter stew. Originally it had game, squirrel, and other things and vegetables. Now it's pretty much chicken and vegetables, but a specialty, especially in Georgia and Virginia, because they both have Brunswick counties, and they all argue about who started it first, right? And then we get to the white dude in the top hat who's just pointing at stuff. We have no idea what his barbecue skill is, but he gets all the credit for this barbecue. So yeah, so this is a great representation of what barbecue was like. Very black-centered, dependent on black labor, because from start to finish, barbecue was possible because of enslaved Africans and later enslaved African Americans. Why? Because old school barbecue took a lot of time to cook, to prep, to clear the area, to build the pit, to serve the food, to clean it up, make the side dishes, provide the music. All of that stuff relied on black labor. Now, let's go about a century ahead of time to Bon Appetit, and they were asked to do a who's who on American barbecue, and this is what they had. All right. You guys know about Where's Waldo? So the virtue of Where's Waldo is Waldo was actually somewhere in the picture. Where are the African Americans? None.
Oh my God.
At all. The only diversity we have is we have this Asian heritage guy in the middle with the beach ball running through the whole scene. And then we've got a woman talking to a guy right here. The question is, how do we get from this very black-centered idea of barbecue to this place where black people have basically disappeared from barbecue? And that's why I wrote Black Smoke, to really delve in and talk about the black contributions to this beloved food tradition. So let's talk about the early iterations of barbecue. According to written history, the earliest account that we have outside of the indigenous people in the Americas talking about what we call barbecue is in Columbus's second voyage. Somebody wrote about that decades later. And essentially, Columbus and his crew come into the Caribbean, essentially what people think now is the Dominican Republic, that island with Dominican Republic and Haiti. They see a raised platform with sticks, with some food on top over a slow fire. There are no humans around, but they see this. As a sign of things to come, Columbus and his crew go ashore and they help themselves to all the food without asking, right? Sign of things to come. And later the indigenous people show up and they're like, oh, you know, so everyone's amazed. They figure out the language and all that kind of stuff and how to communicate. And essentially the word barbecue is an example of a game of historical telephone. This raised platform in the Taino language, which is the indigenous people there, sounded like barbacoa in Spanish. So they were approximating what the indigenous people were calling the raised frame. So it had nothing to do with the cooking process or the food itself. And then later it would become barbecue in English. And then later that gets applied to the cooking process and the food itself. So that's where this comes from. But this wood was green wood that wouldn't burn easily over a slow fire, all right? So the story goes is that Europeans see all this stuff in the Caribbean and they're the ones who bring it to the American South and get barbecue started. But we know that indigenous people in what we now call the United States had their own meat cooking traditions. In some places, they had the raised platform. In other places, they have essentially an earth oven. If you're familiar with South Texas, the barbacoa of South Texas, the idea is that you dig a hole several feet in the ground, and then at the very bottom, you put a mix of rock and wood and set the wood on fire, and it's genius, right? Because the rock retains the heat and keeps cooking. And then you put vegetation in between layers of meat to keep the meat from burning up. And then once you got to the surface level, you would cover that somehow, and you could leave that overnight and come back and eat. Wow. Another thing we saw is the piercing sticks. Essentially, a stick would be in the ground, and there would be other sticks tied to it that were kind of sharp, and whatever meat you were butchering, whether it was fish or game, would be affixed to the piercing stick, and you'd have the fire, and then if you wanted to cook it faster, you would just angle the stick towards the fire. If you wanted to slow it down, you would just angle it back. And this was a great way to cook while you could go do other stuff, right? And then we have the rotating spit, which was something similar to what Europeans were used to and how they cooked. There wasn't metallurgy in the US, what would become the US before Europeans arrived, so they used wood, but essentially it was the spit method. This is what we see in Virginia, the shallow pit method, and I argue that this is the birth of Southern barbecue. So instead of that deep earth oven and the trench, essentially it was a depression in the ground. It may be 1 or 2 feet at the most. Again, the combination of rocks and wood set aflame, but then they would lay green sticks across the top and then put the meat on top of that and let it cook. So you can see how this method eventually becomes that pit barbecue that we see before. So my belief is that barbecue is Native American, its foundation, and later enslaved Africans and colonizing Europeans get in the mix, bringing their own meat cooking techniques. There's kind of a give and take there, and eventually that leads to Southern barbecue. There are people who disagree. All right, some people think barbecue's from Carolina, some people think it's from Europe, some other people think it's from the Caribbean only, other things like that. Some people think it's from Africa. I disagree, and I would just say they're all wrong, but I just want you to know there are different opinions about this. By the time we get to the 19th century, blackness and barbecue are wedded. Here's an example of a newspaper article from Maine. And in it, the guy who wrote the article interviewed a friend of his from Virginia. And I'm going to point to this because the clicker doesn't show up here. But in the sentence here, he says, on the previous day, some favorite Negro man of reputation for skill and experience in the business is sent up with his assistants who proceed to make a kiln or pit of stones. So what he's telling the reader is that if you want legit barbecue as it happens in the South, it's made by a black man in this way, the pit method. And this article is from the 1830s, published in Maine. What I do in my book then is I draw out stories just to kind of show the connections here. So here's one guy named Henry Papa Miller, no relation, but he was somebody who descended from indigenous people in the Americas. And so his family was multiracial. So he had indigenous, white, and black people in his family. But he credits his grandfather, who was an indigenous person, for teaching him this art of barbecue. And one of the big things about him is he is essentially in Leavenworth, Kansas, but makes his way to Kansas City. But he was involved in one of the biggest barbecues ever. In the 1920s, a guy named J.C. Walton won the governor's race for Oklahoma, and he decided to have a big barbecue, which had 120,000 people show up. Whoa. And Henry Papa Miller was one of the cooks at that barbecue. I couldn't prove that he was in charge of the whole barbecue, but he was definitely at that barbecue. So that's a real live example of kind of this Afro-Indigenous barbecue influence coming together. One of the greatest finds in my book with a strong Arkansas connection was a woman named Mary John. She was born Marie Jean when Arkansas was French territory. So she was at the Arkansas Post, and there's this 2 articles about her. One newspaper article in July of 1840 said that she was doing barbecues in the Arkansas River Valley. And what we learned is that she was hired out to do barbecues up and down the Arkansas Valley, and she was essentially what they called a superintendent. So a superintendent is the 19th century version of pitmaster. So we've got an enslaved black woman telling dudes what to do in the 1840s, which is pretty remarkable. This article is her obituary. She dies in 1850. There is racism in it, but in there, they are giving her tribute as they would give any fine European chef, which I think is remarkable. During the course of her life, she's hired out so much that she actually makes enough money to buy her own freedom. And she ends up running a restaurant in Arkansas Post until the end of her life. So that was one of my big finds. And the other thing is, barbecue today is presented as dude food, right? But this shows that sisters have been grilling it for themselves for a long time. So as this 19th century progresses, enslaved African Americans and later their descendants become barbecue's go-to cooks. At that time, there were a few white men involved in barbecue, but you really didn't see them commented upon in any writing. It really isn't until we get to the late 1890s, like that image that I showed you earlier, that you start to see more and more white men involved in barbecue. First chapter that I get into that's thematic is I talk about church barbecue. So I talk about this idea that essentially during slavery, there were a few times where enslaved people could really get together and fellowship without white supervision. And typically that was on Sundays, going to church, and then after church. And usually they would have some kind of barbecue. So we see in black culture, there is this connection between barbecue and spiritual practice. I have to admit that writing this chapter was really distracting to my own spiritual journey. Because now whenever I read the Bible, if I see the words burnt offering, I think about barbecue. And then the whole burning bush story, I just wonder, did it smell like hickory or oak, mesquite? And then the Valley of the Dry Bones, were those spare ribs? Yeah, okay, I'll stop. So here's an example of a newspaper article from Montana in 1920 with the church barbecue. So you can see the connection there. And even after slavery ends, after emancipation, barbecue becomes a way to build community. Because remember, barbecue for several centuries was whole animal cooking. And before refrigeration, you had to have a group of people because you didn't want to waste all that food. So it instantly builds community. This is a guy that you wouldn't know, but he's a big deal in Denver. His name is Daddy Bruce Randolph, and he's from Pastoria, Arkansas. So he comes to Denver in the 1960s, and the reason why he's in this chapter, he's not an ordained preacher or anything, but he was a man who took his faith walk very seriously as a Christian. And so he was known in Denver for creating large barbecues. So every Thanksgiving, inspired by Jesus feeding 5,000, he would essentially give out free meals to 5,000 to 10,000 people in Denver. And he did that for about 3 decades. He lived till he was 94. Born in 1900, he died in 1994. So I include him as somebody who really took that together. And there is a big thing about black preachers doing barbecue. In fact, there is a number of black churches that actually run barbecue restaurants. One of the most famous was New Zion Missionary Baptist Church in Huntsville, Texas, but it closed a few years back. But it was known as the Barbecue Church. And a lot of these barbecue restaurants start out with some brother or sister going to the church just making barbecue for people doing work for the church. And people passing by, hey, y'all selling plates? And they would initially say no, but so many people asked that they just started selling plates, and a barbecue business is born. And then after that chapter, I talk about what I call barbecue freelancers. So these are the people who were forced to learn barbecue during slavery. After emancipation, they've got this highly marketed and coveted skill, and they decide to do barbecues all around the country. People put them on trains, stagecoaches, and all these places to do barbecue. One of the examples is this guy, Columbus B. Hill. And I love Columbus B. Hill because in that era, most of the barbecue people were either not named, or they were called Uncle. They would call him Uncle Columbus. We don't get the full name. They weren't illustrated, and they definitely weren't talked to. He stands out because he's all of those things. He's illustrated. We get his full name. He's treated with dignity, and he's interviewed multiple times in Denver newspapers. He's born in Missouri, makes his way to Denver in the late 1870s, and in the early 1880s, he's doing barbecues for thousands of people. He does a barbecue for 5,000 people in 1882. When the state capitol building in Colorado was dedicated, July 4th, 1890, he does a barbecue for 25,000 people. 1894, he does a lamb barbecue for 10,000 people. But my favorite barbecue story about him is what was known as the famous barbecue riot of 1898. Here was the menu. Okay, this was printed in the paper. Beef, buffalo, possum, bear, mutton, elk, antelope, sheep, rabbits, everything was on the menu. There's a great thing called the stock show in Denver. It's a big agricultural fair. It's a big deal. And in 1898, there was some doubt as to whether Denver would continue hosting it. So the people who organized it said, we're going to have a big barbecue just for VIPs, just for 3,000 people. That was the plan. Word got out in Denver. 30,000 people showed up for this 3,000 person barbecue. There was a clamoring. People smell all this food. They were wondering how they're going to feed everybody, but people wanted that food. Somebody said, okay, maybe if we give out free beer, that will chill people out. Okay, so you can see how this ends, right? It's pretty soon. This is the scene. This is the paper the next day. Above the fold is an illustration of the riot in full effect. 30,000 people attend the barbecue, all right? What I love, and I draw this out, is in the corner, everything, all this havoc around him, this guy is serenely eating his barbecue sandwich. I just love that. The next day, Columbus Hill gets blamed for all of this, I think unfairly. So these are editorials, basically, here's Columbus B. Hill here, blaming him. I think it was unfair. But his reputation did take a hit. He later resuscitated that, but yeah. No, this was national headlines. People were running articles about this story. One of the things in my research is I found his unmarked grave in a Denver cemetery, and through contributions and other work, we actually had a ceremony and got him a gravestone, a headstone, yep. And we put his image on there, and yeah, I was happy to do that. And also I got him inducted into the American Royal Barbecue Hall of Fame. Again, as somebody who's, you know, he is a real place mark for that time, right? Place marker for that time. All right, then I talk about barbecue business. So we have these freelancers that are going from place to place, and then some decide to put roots down in certain communities. One great example for my Kansas City barbecue fans. Do we have any Kansas City barbecue fans here? Okay, we got some. One guy is named Henry Perry. He's acknowledged as the father of Kansas City barbecue. He's first a porter. He shows up in Kansas City in the early 1900s, and then he starts running a barbecue stand in alleys in Kansas City, and eventually he runs a restaurant. He's the guy that taught Gates, Arthur Bryant, and all of those guys how to cook. So he's the guy that did that. But look at his menu. Barbecued meats, possum, again, groundhog, coon, beef, pork, mutton, very eclectic, very eclectic. This woman is probably someone you don't know. Her name is Ernestine Vanderval, and she's from Nicodemus, Kansas, one of the historic black communities in our country, started in 1876. There was a group of people that left the South right after emancipation and the civil rights amendments were passed. They were called exodusters. So they leave the South and they start settling in the Middle West. And Nicodemus is one of those classic communities. So fast forward to the 1950s or so, Ernestine Vanderval is cooking in that community, but eventually she leaves for Los Angeles, and she runs a restaurant in Los Angeles. One of her beloved customers was Walt Disney, loved her food. But later in life, she returns to Nicodemus, Kansas, and runs a barbecue restaurant there. She died about 10 years ago, and her niece is now running that restaurant. Nicodemus now is pretty much a ghost town, and only open really on the weekends, but you can get some good barbecue there. Again, I just wanted to show the connection and the deep roots of black women in barbecue. Yeah. But not everybody welcomed these barbecue entrepreneurs. This is a headline from the Chicago Defender, a black newspaper. In the 1920s, they said, germ dealers imperil health on the South Side. Diseased barbecue sold out of dirt holes by unsanitary cooks. So being entrepreneurs, people were trying to sell barbecue any way they could. So they would get bathtubs, toilets, whatever, and cook in those and sell barbecue. And so, you know, not everybody welcomed them. Now, here is a fine sticking point. There is this belief out there, floating out there, that barbecue should be unsauced. I'm going to go out on a limb and say African Americans will say, says who? Yeah. Because in African American barbecue culture, often the sauce is the thing that distinguishes your barbecue, because it's just assumed that you know how to cook the meat. So the sauce is where you set yourself apart. One of the famous sauce guys was a guy named Arthur Bryant in Kansas City. So when he died in 1982, this was an editorial cartoon in the newspaper. And so he shows him at the pearly gates with St. Peter, and St. Peter's only question, did you bring sauce? Well, here's an example of an African American being used in an advertisement for a Georgia barbecue sauce. Very similar to Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, Faustus, right? The idea that a black person is going to communicate culinary excellence to a consumer. He's treated in a dignified way, I feel, and he's doing traditional pit barbecue. This ad ran in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and for just maybe a year or so in the early 1900s, and then you just don't see it anymore. That's the only example that I can find of trying to mass market a barbecue sauce using a black image, which is really interesting to me. But that again shows the ties and how deeply enshrined barbecue was connected to black culinary excellence. All right, then I talk about competition barbecue, which is its own thing now. I am a certified barbecue judge, and I can tell you about how I became one during the Q&A if you're interested. One of the biggest contests now is the Memphis in May competition. You are a certified Memphis in May judge?
Well, I just have an honorary PhD,
And tell people what a PhD is.
a doctorate in barbecue.
A doctorate in barbecue. All right. That's the degree I want to get. So I'm certified in the Kansas City Barbecue Society and also the Memphis in May competition. But the Memphis in May competition is the biggest competition in the world. Started in the late 70s. It was just kind of a casual thing. The very first Memphis in May winner is this woman, Bessie Mae Cathay. And she just pulled up with a pickup truck and a setup on the back. And she won the whole thing with that. Can you imagine that happening now? If you watch any of the barbecue competition shows, the chance of that happening is very, very rare. But she's the very first person to win the Memphis in May competition. I also talk about Sylvie Curry, the Lady of Q. She's very distinguished on the barbecue competition circuit. I would say she's the most celebrated black woman on the competition circuit. And the thing is, she does all of this by herself.
No.
Yeah, she calls it Sylvie time because she has a husband who wants to help her, and he just, no. She's just like, get out of my space, right? But she is just killing it, and she does it all by herself. All right, let's talk about African American influenced regional styles. Okay, people from the Carolinas, don't get mad. It's just for the sake of time that I'm condensing you all. I know you have distinct culinary traditions and everything like that, but I argue that the Eastern North Carolina style is really what Virginia barbecue was, and then it migrated south. I get mad at Virginia people. I was like, you guys should be boosters for your barbecue because you're letting all these other people get credit for it. But the Eastern North Carolina style, which is the whole hog, vinegar, sauce dressed, is very similar to what they do in Virginia. And then you go to the western part of the state, the vinegar sauce gets some ketchup added, some tomato added, and it's really more about pork shoulders. This is a place called Grady's Barbecue in Dudley, North Carolina. Unfortunately, Mr. Grady died last week. But I was glad that we got him his flowers. Through my efforts, we got him inducted to the the American Royal Barbecue Hall of Fame last year. So he was alive, he was alert, and he got his flowers before he died. So I'm so glad we did that. But if you ever make your way to Dudley, North Carolina, it is definitely exquisite barbecue. Now that it's just his widow and some family members, I don't know how much longer that restaurant's going to be open. But the Carolinas is a very definitive style. Not many people are feeling the Carolina barbecue style across the country. I think it's because of the vinegar. And my feeling is people are not getting true North Carolina or South Carolina barbecue, because what's happening outside the country or outside the state of North Carolina and South Carolina is that people are making barbecue one way and they're just adding vinegar as a condiment. And that's not the way you make North Carolina barbecue. You add it through the cooking process because it adds a depth of flavor. I feel that there is a deep South style, primarily chicken, pork shoulder, and barbecued ribs, usually a tomato-based sauce that has vinegar and some sweetness, and then soul food sides added to that. Another tradition is East Texas. Right now, Texas barbecue is the it barbecue. But when we talk about Texas barbecue, people pretty much focus just on Central Texas. So they're not looking at the Latino, indigenous influence, culture, barbecue culture in the South. They're not looking at the West, the Pico style, and they're definitely not looking at the East part of the state. When Texas alternated between being its own independent country, a Mexican territory, and its own state, but a lot of people left Virginia, Tennessee, and other places and went to Texas, the eastern part of Texas, to cultivate cotton and other things. So there was extensive slavery in East Texas, and barbecue came with those enslaved people. So East Texas, there still is a beef and pork tradition, but unlike the perfectly manicured and Instagrammable barbecue you see from Central Texas, it's gonna be sloppy. So it's gonna be chopped up meat, the pork's gonna be chopped up, it's gonna be all drenched in sauce, it's gonna be delicious. And then because of the proximity to New Orleans and Louisiana, there's definitely a Creole influence. So they have boudin sausage, but they spell it differently. It's Boudain. I don't know why. And dirty rice and other things will be served with that barbecue. And then there's Kansas City, my favorite barbecue style, which is a complete mix of all these different cultures because Kansas City was an agricultural crossroads. And so you've got pork, you've got beef, you've got hot links, you've got mutton, you've got ham, and usually it's all sauced and then drowned under a pile of fries. Generalizing, if you go to an African American barbecue restaurant anywhere in the country, this is typically what you're going to see in terms of meat. You're going to see pork spare ribs, chopped pork shoulder, some kind of chicken, hot links, which is a spicy, coarsely ground sausage. And that's usually what you're going to see. And then some specialties that have emerged recently are rib tips. Now, rib tips are popular all over the place, but a lot of people say that rib tips started in Chicago. There was a guy named Leon Finney who left the South and moved to Chicago in the 40s, and in the 50s he opened up a barbecue joint. And the origin of rib tips is this. The agricultural meat packers, when they were creating spare ribs, they created a St. Louis rack. So if you're not familiar with this, if you look at a rack of ribs, it's usually ovular in shape, and so they're trying to create a uniform appearance. And so they trim off the top, the bottom, and the sides, and when they trim off the top, they're trimming off the tops of those ribs, the rib tips. And so they would just throw those away. So Finney would just dumpster dive after the stockyards closed, wash those off, and smoke them up and started selling them. So that became a signature of Chicago barbecue. So that's how rib tips get started. Most African American places are going to have the rib tip attached if you go there. Usually it's not cut off for most old school black joints. Another thing, if you're familiar with Southern Illinois, kind of Kentucky area, there's something called Monroe County pork steaks. This is from Kentucky, and essentially this is pork shoulder that's frozen, and then they cut it while it's frozen, about a ½ inch thick, and then put it on the grill to cook it and get some texture, and then slap it on white bread and add some sauce and other things. All right. And then, y'all know about barbecue bologna? Yes. Oh, what an educated crowd. All right. For those who don't know, barbecue bologna is spectacular. So what they do, and remember, this is not the bologna of your childhood where you came home from school, you got that little slice, you warmed up the skillet, you put the slice in the skillet, it popped up, and then you cut a slit in it, then you put some cheese on it, and then you get some bread. So, no, it's not that. So what they do is they get the tube of bologna, stab it, to create slits, put that on the smoker for several hours until it's impossibly soft. And then when you order, they would cut off a ½ inch or so and then put it on the grill to get some texture, and then white bread and everything. It's glorious. And then what about barbecue spaghetti? Do you know about barbecue spaghetti? Okay. Barbecue spaghetti, for those who don't know, essentially you have the noodles, and instead of marinara, you have barbecue sauce and then grilled meat with some spices. It's incredible. It's so awesome. All right, this is a public service announcement. Burnt ends is one of the most popular cuts of barbecue right now, and I don't care what anybody in Texas tells you, burnt ends were popularized by this man, Arthur Bryant in Kansas City. Burnt ends are from the part of the brisket that's it has some meat, but it's pretty gristly, a lot of fat. So for the longest time, restaurateurs would just chop that off and throw it away. So the innovation from Arthur Bryant, he said, you know what, I'm going to cut that up and then put it in a bowl and put it on the counter for my customers to eat while they're waiting for their orders. So this is what's straight up nasty. People were just with their grubby hands just getting it in the bowl and getting burnt ends, right? But this is how burnt ends used to look. Because again, it was just the shards of gristly fat meat that was just cut off. So these perfect cubes that you all are paying $36 a pound for, here's the one thing, they didn't used to exist. And then the other thing, it's actually not burnt ends. You're just getting chopped up brisket. And you're paying $36 for that, okay? Because there's limited real estate on a brisket for those burnt ends. And so that's marketing genius that's happening right now. But Arthur Bryant's, okay? From Kansas City. So question is, why does barbecue, by the time we get to this presentation by Bon Appetit, why is it so white-centered? And part of the reason is because of foodies like me. People that love food, we take pictures of our food, and we will travel for food. So this group of people called foodies really emerges in the late 80s and early 90s. They've got disposable income, they're curious about food, and they want to know, what's this thing called barbecue, and where do I get the good stuff? from the media depictions that arise, instead of showing the diverse world of barbecue, essentially they start focusing on white dudes. And there's 4 types of archetypal white dudes in barbecue that get focused upon. First is the Bubba type, right? Ball cap, overalls, from the South. He's got skills, right? So that's one type. The next one is the competition cook. The dudes with the Bluetooth, the syringes, all kinds of scientific applications to their barbecue. The ones you're seeing on all of these shows right now, which makes competition